The fluorescent lights of Los Angeles International Airport cast long shadows across the polished floors as Officer Ryan Martinez walked his familiar route through the terminal, for the late afternoon rush was in full swing. Business people wheeling carry-ons with practice-deficiency families juggling strollers and diaper bags, tourists clutching boarding passes like lifelines, the cacophony of rolling luggage gate announcements, and 1,000 conversations in dozens of languages created the symphony Ryan had grown accustomed to over his 8 years on the airport security force. Beside him, Rex moved with the fluid grace of a seasoned professional. The 5-year-old German Shepherd's dark coat gleamed under the artificial lights. His intelligent brown eyes, constantly scanning the crowd, Rex wasn't just Ryan's partner. He was his best friend, confidant, and the most reliable colleague he'd ever worked with. Their bond had been forged through countless hours of training, routine patrols, and the occasional high-stakes situation that reminded them both why their work mattered. Rex's nose twitched as they passed Gate 14, where Flight 447 to Denver was boarding the usual mix of travelers queued at the gate. Some reading, others on phones, children fidgeting while parents checked tickets for the 100th time. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to Ryan's trained eye. But Rex had stopped moving. The dog's entire posture changed in an instant. His ears shot forward, tail stiffening into a straight line behind him. His head turned with mechanical precision toward a man in his early 50s wearing a long gray wool coat. The passenger was unremarkable, medium height, thinning brown hair with streaks of silver, wire-rimmed glasses perched on a narrow nose. He carried a worn leather briefcase and stood in the middle of the boarding line looking like any other business traveler trying to get home. But Rex saw something Ryan didn't. German Shepherd's breathing became shallow and focused, his muscles coiled beneath his coat as if preparing to spring. Ryan had seen this behavior hundreds of times during training, but rarely with such intensity. During routine patrols, Rex was locked onto something. Some signal that had triggered every instinct in his highly trained body. "What is it, boy?" Ryan murmured, his hand instinctively moving to rest on Rex's back. The dog's muscles were rigid with concentration. The man in the gray coat seemed oblivious to the attention. He shuffled forward with the line, checking his phone, adjusting his glasses. But there was something in his movements, a subtle tension that Ryan's years of experience had taught him to recognize. The man's eyes darted around the terminal more than necessary. His free hand kept moving to his coat pocket, then away as if checking for something. Rex took a step forward, then another. His nose was working overtime, now nostrils flaring as he processed whatever scent had captured his attention. Other passengers began to notice the dog's behavior. Conversations quieted, children pointed. The natural flow of foot traffic around their small group began to slow as people sensed something significant was happening. Ryan felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation that had saved his life more than once during his previous career as a Marine and had proven invaluable in his current role. Rex was never wrong. In 5 years of partnership, the dog had led him to everything from concealed weapons to missing children to drug smugglers. If Rex was alerting, there was a reason. The man in the gray coat had reached the boarding gate agent. Ryan heard him speak in a soft, nervous voice. "David Chen, seat 12A. Hands trembled slightly as he handed over his boarding pass. The tremor was barely noticeable, but Rex saw it. To the dog's ears flattened slightly, not in aggression, but in that particular way that meant he was processing complex information. Made his decision. They would approach for a routine screening. Nothing unusual about that. K9 units conducted random security checks all the time. Passengers were generally cooperative, understanding that these measures were for everyone's safety. But as Ryan took his first step toward the boarding gate, Rex's behavior intensified. The German Shepherd's tail went completely still. His head lowered slightly, and he began that particular focused walk that Ryan had learned meant serious business. The sounds of the terminal seemed to fade into background noise as Ryan's world narrowed to the man in the gray coat and his partner's unwavering attention. Other passengers were definitely noticing now. The boarding process had slowed as people turned to watch the K9 team approach. Gate agents looked up from their computers. Even seasoned travelers who had seen countless security procedures paused to observe. The man calling himself David Chen was just stepping onto the jet bridge when he glanced back and saw them coming. For just a moment, maybe half a second, his carefully composed expression cracked. Fear flickered across his features before the mask of calm professionalism slid back into place. But Rex had seen it too. The dog's pace quickened, and Ryan felt the first real spike of adrenaline hit his system. Whatever was about to happen, he knew with absolute certainty that this routine afternoon patrol was about to become anything but routine. Rex's instincts had never failed them before, and the intensity of the dog's focus told Ryan that they were about to uncover something significant. The air in Terminal 4 seemed to thicken with anticipation as man and dog closed the distance to Gate 14, where a passenger in a gray coat was about to change the course of their entire day. "Sir, excuse me," Ryan called out in his most professional tone as he and Rex approached the jet bridge entrance. "I'm Officer Martinez with airport security. Would you mind stepping aside for a routine screening?" The man who had identified himself as David Chen froze halfway through handing his boarding pass to the gate agent. His shoulders tensed visibly beneath the gray wool coat, and when he turned around, Ryan could see a thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the terminal's aggressive air conditioning him. "Sorry, is there a problem?" The man's voice carried a slight tremor that he was clearly trying to suppress. "My flight is boarding now. I really can't afford to miss it. I have a very important meeting in Denver first thing tomorrow morning." Rex had positioned himself directly in front of the passenger, his intense gaze never wavering from the gray coat. The dog's nostrils flared rhythmically as he processed whatever scent had triggered his initial alert. Other passengers in the boarding line had begun to cluster behind them, some craning their necks to get a better view, others pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming an unusual situation. "This will only take a moment, sir," Ryan assured him, though he could feel his own pulse beginning to quicken. In his experience, innocent passengers were typically mildly annoyed by security delays, but ultimately cooperative. The level of anxiety radiating from this man was setting off every alarm bell in Ryan's head. "Standard procedure, Rex here, just needs to do a quick check." The passenger's eyes darted from Ryan to Rex and back again. "Is this really necessary? I mean, I've already been through security, my luggage was screened, I had to take off my shoes, go through the body scanner." His voice was rising slightly, drawing even more attention from nearby travelers. "I understand your frustration, sir, but yes, this is necessary." Ryan kept his tone calm and authoritative. He'd had this conversation hundreds of times. With hundreds of passengers, K9 units perform random additional screenings throughout the terminal. It's all part of keeping everyone safe. Rex had begun his systematic inspection of the passenger, starting with the man's shoes and working his way up. The German Shepherd's movements were methodical and professional, but Ryan could see the coiled tension in every muscle. This wasn't routine sniffing. Rex was hunting for something specific. "Your name again, sir?" Ryan asked, pulling out his notepad. "David Chen, KHN." The man spelled it out quickly, his eyes never leaving Rex as the dog moved closer to his torso. "Look, I really don't understand what's happening here. I'm just trying to get home to my family." The gate agent had stepped forward, clearly torn between her responsibility to board passengers on schedule and her duty to cooperate with security. "Officer, Flight 447 is supposed to depart in 20 minutes. We're already running a few minutes behind, I understand, and we'll be as quick as possible," Ryan replied, but his attention was focused entirely on Rex. The dog had moved to the passenger's left side and was now sniffing intently at the coat's midsection. His tail had gone completely rigid, a sign that Ryan had learned to interpret as "I found something significant." A small crowd had begun to gather around. Gate 14 passengers from nearby gates had wandered over to see what was happening. Children pressed against the glass walls, pointing at the German Shepherd. The normal buzz of terminal conversation had quieted in their immediate area, replaced by the tension of anticipation. "Sir, I'm going to need you to remove your coat for inspection," Ryan said, his professional demeanor masking the growing certainty that Rex had detected something important. The passenger's face went pale. "Remove my coat, here, in front of all these people." He gestured at the crowd that had formed around them. This is harassment. I know my rights. You absolutely do know your rights, sir, and you have the right to request that we conduct this screening in a private area if you prefer. But the coat does need to be inspected." Ryan's tone remained perfectly level, but he positioned himself slightly to block any potential exit routes. Not that he expected trouble. The man seemed more terrified than aggressive, but years of training had taught him to always be prepared. X suddenly went very still. He was focused on the left side of the coat, now his nose just inches from what appeared to be an inside pocket. The dog's breathing had become shallow and controlled, and Ryan recognized the signs. Immediately Rex had located the source of whatever had triggered his initial alert. "Actually, you know what?" the passenger said, his voice cracking slightly. Maybe we could do this somewhere more private. There are so many people watching and I really don't like being the center of attention." But even as he spoke, Rex was moving closer to the coat. The German Shepherd's head tilted slightly as he honed in on whatever he had detected. His training was too thorough, his instincts too strong to be deterred by the passenger's nervousness or the growing crowd of onlookers. Ryan was about to respond when Rex did something that made everyone in a 20-foot radius go completely silent. The German Shepherd barked. It wasn't the friendly woof of a pet or the warning growl of an aggressive animal. It was a sharp, authoritative bark that seemed to echo through the entire gate area, the sound of a highly trained professional announcing that he had found exactly what he was looking. Fourth passenger jumped backward as if he'd been shocked, nearly stumbling into the gate agent. Several people in the crowd gasped. A child started crying. Even Ryan felt his heart skip a beat at the sudden commanding sound. Rex never barked during routine inspections. "Never, sir," Ryan said, and this time there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "I'm going to need you to step over here with me right now." The passenger's eyes darted toward the jet bridge, then toward the main terminal, as if calculating escape routes. His hands were shaking visibly now, and Ryan could see sweat beading along his hairline. "Don't understand," the man whispered, but his protest sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "I haven't done anything wrong, I'm just trying to catch my flight." Rex barked again, shorter this time, but no less definitive. The dog was now staring directly at the left side of the passenger's coat, his entire body coiled with professional intensity. Ryan felt that familiar surge of adrenaline that always preceded significant discoveries. In his gut, he knew with absolute certainty that Rex had found something important. The question was, what? Dan. Based on the passenger's increasingly panicked demeanor, Ryan suspected they were about to find out. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Gate 14 had become the focal point of hundreds of curious eyes, all waiting to see what would happen next. Somewhere in the back of Ryan's mind, a small voice whispered that this exact moment, was going to change everything. Please extend your arms to your sides, Sir, Ryan instructed, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of authority that brooked no argument. The passenger, calling himself David Chen, complied with obvious reluctance, his hands trembling as he raised his arms. Rex maintained his position directly in front of the man, his intense gaze never wavering from the left side of the gray coat. The German Shepherd's training was evident in every controlled movement. He remained perfectly still while Ryan began to pet, but his alertness was so focused it was almost tangible. The crowd around Gate 14 had grown substantially. Passengers from neighboring gates had abandoned their own boarding processes to watch the drama unfold. Children pressed against the glass barriers while parents whispered explanations. The normal sounds of the terminal rolling luggage overhead announcements, conversation, seemed muted in their immediate vicinity, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something significant. Hands moved methodically over the coat's exterior, checking for anything unusual. The wool was expensive, well-tailored, but showed signs of extensive, whereas his fingers traced the outline of the left interior pocket. He felt Rex's attention intensify. Even further, the dog's breathing became more rapid, his nostrils flaring as he processed whatever scent had captured his focus. Sir, I'm going to need to check your interior pockets, Ryan said, his hand moving toward the left side of the coat. Wait, the passenger said quickly, his voice cracking. Maybe I should tell you that I have some personal items in their family photos, you know. They're very private, very important to me. Ryan's training kicked in immediately. Passengers who suddenly wanted to explain the contents of their pockets before they were searched were almost always concealing something significant. I understand, sir. I'll handle everything with appropriate care. Ryan's fingers approached the inside pocket. Rex's entire body went rigid, the dog's ears flattened against his head, not in aggression, but in the particular way that meant he was processing complex, emotionally charged information. In their 5 years together, Ryan had learned to read these subtle signals like a book. Please don't, the passenger whispered, but his protest was barely audible. Ryan's fingers found the pocket opening and immediately felt something crinkled and worn inside. As he began to carefully extract whatever was there, the passenger's composure finally cracked. Completely. No, please, you don't understand, he started to say, reaching toward Ryan's hand, but Rex was faster. The German Shepherd stepped smoothly between the passenger and Ryan, his body language shifting from alert to protective. A low rumble emanated from his chest, not quite a growl, but a clear warning that the passenger should not interfere with the search. And that's when it happened. As Ryan's hand emerged from the pocket, his fingers lost their grip on the worn envelope he'd been trying to extract carefully. The packet slipped from his grasp and fell toward the polished terminal floor. Time seemed to slow as the envelope tumbled through the air. Ryan instinctively reached for it, but gravity won. The worn manila envelope hit the floor with a soft thud, and its contents scattered across the gleaming tiles. The entire gate area fell into complete silence. Photographs, old faded photographs, spread across the floor like fallen leaves. But these weren't typical family snapshots. Even from Ryan's position standing above them, he could see that they were all of the same person. A young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing what appeared to be military fatigues. But it was the other item that made everyone within sight of the scene freeze in place, a military badge tarnished with age, and where had skittered several feet from the photographs. Even under the harsh fluorescent lights, Ryan could make out the distinctive eagle and shield of the U.S. Army. The passenger, David Chen, if that was really his name, let out a sound that was part sob, part gasp. He lunged forward, dropping to his knees, his hands reaching desperately for the scattered items. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking completely. Please don't. Those are all I have left of her. Rex stepped forward and gently but firmly placed himself between the kneeling man and the scattered photographs. The German Shepherd's demeanor had changed completely. The alert tension was still there, but now it was mixed with something Ryan had rarely seen from his partner. Gentle compassion. Ryan knelt down and carefully gathered the photographs, his training warring with human curiosity. The images were clearly old. The colors had that faded quality of pictures from decades past. All showed the same young woman, sometimes alone, sometimes with groups of soldiers. In several of the photos, Ryan could see tear stains along the edges, as if someone had cried while holding them. Sir, Ryan said quietly, I'm going to need you to explain what these are and why you have them. The passenger remained on his knees, his shoulders shaking. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears that he was no longer trying to hide. That's my daughter, he whispered, his voice so broken that Ryan had to strain to hear him. That's Sarah. She was. Oh God, I haven't seen these pictures in so long. The crowd pressed closer, but something about the raw emotion of the moment kept them respectfully quiet. Children who had been chattering fell silent. Adults found themselves holding their breath. Ryan examined the military badge more closely. It was definitely S Army and appeared to be from a unit designation he didn't immediately recognize. The metal was worn smooth in places as if it had been handled countless times over many years. When was this photograph taken? Ryan asked gently, holding up one of the clearer images of the young woman 20 years ago. The man whispered right before he couldn't finish the sentence. That's when Ryan noticed movement at the edge of his peripheral vision. Two people in dark suits were making their way through the crowd, their purposeful stride, and the way other passengers automatically moved aside, marking them clearly as law enforcement federal agents. Rex sensed the shift in atmosphere. Immediately his head turned toward the approaching agents, his body language becoming alert in an entirely different way. The German Shepherd positioned himself protectively near the kneeling passenger, as if sensing that the man was in emotional distress rather than being a threat. Mind raced. Federal agents didn't just happen to be in the vicinity. When K9 units made random discoveries, which meant either this wasn't random, or David Chen, or whatever his real name was, had been under surveillance. The lead agent, a woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, approached, with her credentials already out. Officer Martinez. Agent Sarah Williams, FBI, we need to speak with you and your subject immediately. The passenger looked up at the sound of the agent's voice, and Ryan saw something flicker across his features. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the weary acceptance of someone who had been running from something for a very long time. Please, the man said again, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the terminal. Can I hold the pictures? Just for a moment. Ryan looked at the photographs in his hands, then at the broken man kneeling on the terminal floor, then at the federal agents who clearly had answers to questions he hadn't even known. Rex sat down beside the passenger and gently rested his head against the man's shoulder. A gesture of comfort that was completely outside his normal professional behavior, but somehow felt exactly right for the moment. The storm outside had intensified, and Ryan could hear rain lashing against the terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows. The sound seemed to underscore the gravity of whatever was unfolding at Gate 14, where a routine security screening had just uncovered what was clearly a story much larger and more complex than anyone could have anticipated. Agent Williams guided them to a small security office adjacent to Gate 14, away from the curious crowd that had gathered to witness the unfolding drama. The passenger, whose real name Ryan was about to learn, was not David Chen, sat hunched in a plastic chair, clutching the faded photographs with trembling hands. Rex had followed them into the office and positioned himself near the man, his usual professional detachment, replaced by an almost protective stance. Mr. Robert Hayes, Agent Williams said, settling into the chair across from him. Her tone was firm, but not unkind, or should I say, former Sergeant Robert Hayes, U.S. Army Rangers, retired. The man looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but no longer surprised. You know who I am? We've been looking for you for quite some time. Williams replied, 3 years to be exact, ever since you disappeared from your apartment in Phoenix, leaving behind a suicide note that we now know was staged. Ryan felt his world shift. This wasn't just about suspicious behavior or concealed items. This was about a man who had been living under false identities, carrying military photographs and a badge that belonged to someone else. The badge. Williams continued, nodding toward the tarnished piece of metal that now sat on the small table between them. It belonged to Private First Class Sarah Hayes, your daughter. She went missing from Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Hayes, his real name, closed his eyes tightly when he spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. She didn't go missing. She was taken. Rex's ears perked up at the emotional intensity in the man's voice. The German Shepherd's training had taught him to detect deception, but what he was sensing now wasn't dishonesty. It was profound grief mixed with desperate hope. Mr. Hayes, Agent Williams leaned forward. Your daughter was declared missing in action. In 2004, the Army conducted an extensive investigation. There was no evidence of abduction, no ransom demands, no communication from hostile forces. She simply vanished during a routine supply convoy. That's what they wanted everyone to believe, Hayes said, his voice growing stronger. But Sarah found something. She called me 3 days before she disappeared. She was terrified, said she'd stumbled onto something big, something involving weapons shipments that weren't going where they were supposed to. Ryan watched the interplay between the federal agent and the desperate father, trying to piece together a story that was clearly far more complex than a simple security screening. What kind of weapons shipments? Hayes turned to look at Ryan directly for the first time since they'd sat down. The kind that were being diverted to private contractors. The kind that ended up in the hands of people who weren't supposed to have them. Sarah was a supply clerk. She had access to manifest shipping records. She saw the discrepancies. Agent Williams consulted a thick file she'd brought with her. Mr. Hayes, I understand your desire to believe that your daughter uncovered some kind of conspiracy, but the investigation found no evidence of any weapons diversions, no missing inventory, no irregularities in the supply chain. Of course, they didn't find evidence, Hayes said bitterly. The people involved were the same people conducting the investigation. Rex suddenly lifted his head, his attention focused on something outside the office through the small window. Ryan could see that the crowd at Gate 14 had largely dispersed, but there were still several people in suits conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of the area where the photographs had fallen. Mr. Hayes, Williams continued, for the past 20 years, you've been traveling under false identities, following up on supposed leads about your daughter's whereabouts. You've interfered with multiple federal investigations, broken into government databases, and generally made yourself a person of interest in several ongoing cases. Hayes looked down at the photographs again. In the harsh fluorescent light of the small office, Ryan could see more details than he had on the terminal floor. Sarah Hayes had her father's eyes, intelligent, determined, but with a warmth that suggested she had been loved deeply. I found her, Hayes said quietly. The simple statement hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded, yet Agent Williams went very still. What did you say? I found her 3 weeks ago. That's why I was traveling. That's why I had these pictures with me. Hayes's hands tightened on the photographs. She's alive. Ryan felt Rex tense beside him. The German Shepherd's instincts were clearly telling him that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't understand the human complexities of the situation. Mr. Hayes, that's impossible. If your daughter were alive, if she had been held captive for 20 years. She wasn't held captive, Hayes interrupted. She was hidden, protected by people who knew that if her real identity was discovered, she'd be killed to cover up what she had learned at age. Williams opened her mouth to respond, but Hayes continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. She's been living under an assumed name in a small town in Montana, working as a nurse. She doesn't even remember her real name. They told her she had been in an accident, that she had amnesia, that her family was dead. But she kept having dreams about a man in military uniform who used to read her bedtime stories. She kept drawing pictures of a German Shepherd that looked exactly like the one our family had when she was a child. Rex's tail moved slightly. Not quite a wag, but a sign that he was responding to the emotional intensity of the story. The people who helped her disappear, Hayes continued, they were good people, military personnel, who realized that Sarah had uncovered something that went all the way to the top of the command structure. They made a choice to save her life rather than let her become another casualty of a cover-up agent. Williams was taking notes, but her expression remained skeptical. Mr. Hayes, do you have any proof of these claims? Hayes reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small cell phone. I have her phone number. I have the address of the clinic where she works. I have photographs from 3 weeks ago, when I finally found her. His voice broke again. I have a daughter who doesn't remember me, but who agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Denver tomorrow morning. The storm outside had intensified even further. Rain was now pelting the windows. With enough force to be audible even inside the small office, the sound seemed to emphasize the weight of the moment, as if nature itself was responding to the gravity of what was being revealed. Agent Williams closed her file and looked directly at Hayes. Mr. Hayes, if what you're telling us is true, and I emphasize, if, then you've just provided information that could reopen one of the most significant military investigations of the past 2 decades. Rex stood up and moved closer to Hayes's chair. The German Shepherd's demeanor had shifted completely from professional detection to something that looked remarkably like comfort and support. Without any command from Ryan, the dog gently placed his head on Hayes's knee. Hayes looked down at Rex, and for the first time since the photographs had fallen to the floor, smiled slightly. You're a good boy, he whispered. You knew, didn't you? You knew I wasn't a threat. You knew I was just a father, trying to find his daughter. Ryan watched his partner with amazement. In 5 years of working together, he had never seen Rex respond to a subject with such obvious compassion. It was as if the German Shepherd had somehow sensed the truth behind the complex story they had just heard. Williams, Ryan said quietly, what happens now? The federal agent looked from Hayes to Rex to Ryan, then back to the photographs that had started it all. Now, she said, we make some phone calls. And if Mr. Hayes is telling the truth, we're about to discover that a 20-year-old cold case is about to become very hot. Indeed, outside the storm continued to rage, but inside the small security office at Gate 14 a different kind of storm was brewing, one that might finally bring justice, truth, and a family back together after 2 decades of separation and searching. 6 hours later, the small security office had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Additional federal agents had arrived, along with military investigators, and what appeared to be representatives from the Department of Defense. Coffee cups and takeout containers littered the small table, evidence of the long day that had stretched into evening. Robert Hayes sat in the same plastic chair, but he was no longer the broken man who had been discovered at Gate 14. The photographs of his daughter were now safely secured in an evidence folder, but not before he had been allowed to hold them one more time. More importantly, his cell phone had been returned to him after federal investigators had confirmed what seemed impossible. His daughter was indeed alive, working under the name Michelle Carter at a rural medical clinic in Montana. Rex had remained in the office for most of the afternoon, his presence somehow providing comfort to Hayes while the investigators worked to verify his story. The German Shepherd had dozed fitfully near Hayes's chair, but his ears remained alert as if he understood that his job wasn't quite finished. Yet Agent Williams had spent the last 3 hours on secure phone lines speaking with military investigators, reviewing classified files that hadn't been opened in years, and coordinating with federal prosecutors, who were already beginning to discuss the possibility of reopening multiple cases related to military contract fraud. "Mr. Hayes," she said, hanging up from her latest call, "I have news." Hayes looked up, his eyes still red from exhaustion and emotional strain, but now also bright with something that looked like hope. "The investigators in Montana have made contact with your daughter. She's safe, and she's confirmed many of the details you provided about her circumstances." Williams paused, consulting her notes. "More importantly, she's remembered something that corroborates your story about weapons diversions." Ryan, who had remained in the office to provide support for Rex, leaned forward. "What kind of something?" "She kept a diary during her time in Afghanistan. She hid it in her personal effects before she disappeared, thinking that if something happened to her, it might serve as evidence to people who helped her disappear, retrieved it, and have been keeping it safe for 20 years, waiting for a time when it would be safe to reveal what she had discovered." Hayes's hands began to shake again, but this time from relief rather than fear. "So she did find evidence of the weapons diversions?" "More than that, she documented a systematic pattern of military supplies being diverted to private contractors with known connections to hostile forces, names, dates, shipping manifests, everything that military investigators had claimed didn't exist." Rex lifted his head and looked directly at Hayes, his tail moving in what was unmistakably a slow, satisfied wag. "The German Shepherd seemed to understand that something good was happening." Agent Williams continued. "The people who helped her disappear included a master sergeant who had been investigating the same irregularities independently. When they realized that Sarah's life was in danger, they made the decision to stage her disappearance and provide her with a new identity. They've been watching over her ever since, waiting for the right moment to come forward. And now," Hayes asked, "now we have enough evidence to file federal charges against several individuals who were involved in the original cover-up. More importantly," Williams smiled slightly, "we have a father and daughter who are going to be reunited tomorrow morning." The storm outside had finally begun to subside. The rain was still falling, but the violent intensity had given way to a steady, cleansing downpour that washed the windows clean and made the terminal lights sparkle in the gathering dark. Just Ryan looked out at the terminal where normal operations had resumed hours ago. Passengers were boarding flights, families were reuniting, business travelers were heading home. But here in this small office, something extraordinary had concluded. A story of love, loss, persistence, and ultimately justice. "Agent Williams," Ryan said, "what would have happened if Rex hadn't alerted on Mr. Hayes today?" The federal agent considered the question seriously. "Honestly, Mr. Hayes probably would have made it to Denver, met with his daughter, and continued living under a false identity. The evidence that Sarah had collected would have remained hidden. The people responsible for the weapons diversions would have continued to live their lives without ever being held accountable for what they did." Hayes reached down and gently scratched Rex behind the ears. "This dog," he said quietly, "this dog changed everything. He didn't just find evidence, he found justice." Rex responded with a soft rumble that was somewhere between a purr and a growl, the sound he made when he was completely convinced. The evening wore on. Arrangements were made for Hayes to travel to Montana under federal protection. His false identity documents were replaced with legitimate travel papers bearing his real name. The investigation that would follow would take months, possibly years, but the foundation had been laid for bringing closure to a 20-year-old injustice. At 11 p.m., Ryan and Rex finally left the terminal and walked out into the rain-soaked Los Angeles night. The storm had passed, leaving behind clean air and the promise of clear skies. "Tomorrow, good job, partner," Ryan said, scratching Rex behind the ears as they walked toward their patrol car. "I still don't understand how you knew, but you knew." Rex wagged his tail and looked up at his human partner with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen so much during their years together. Then the German Shepherd did something he had never done before. He sat down in the middle of the parking lot and howled. It wasn't a mournful sound, but rather a triumphant announcement that seemed to echo off the terminal buildings and carry across the entire airport complex. Other dogs in the vicinity began to howl in response, creating a brief symphony of canine celebration that made Ryan smile, despite his exhaustion. "I think," Ryan said, "you're telling everyone that justice was served tonight." Rex stopped howling and stood up, tail wagging as if to confirm that interpretation. 2 days later, Ryan received a phone call from Agent Williams. Robert Hayes had successfully reunited with his daughter in Montana. Sarah, who had chosen to reclaim her birth name, remembered her father almost immediately when she saw him. The diary she had kept had provided enough evidence to arrest 3 former military officers and 5 defense contractors on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. But perhaps most importantly, a family torn apart by greed and corruption had been restored. Drax continued his regular patrols at LAX, sniffing out contraband, detecting suspicious behavior, and serving as both protector and comfort to the thousands of travelers who passed through the terminal each day. But airport personnel noticed that the German Shepherd seemed to carry himself with a different kind of pride. Now, as if he understood that he had accomplished something truly significant, sometimes late at night when the terminal was quiet, Ryan would walk Rex past Gate 14, and remember the afternoon when routine screening had uncovered an extraordinary story of love, loss, and ultimate redemption. And, sometimes, just sometimes, Rex would sit down at that exact spot and wag his tail as if he too remembered the day when a few